Hi, this is Professor Clay. Section 16-2, I'm going to talk about static RAMs. Large-scale random access memory, RAM, also known as read-write memory, is used for temporary storage of data and program instructions in microprocessor-based systems. The term random access means that the user can access, by reading or writing, data at any location within the entire memory device randomly without having to sequentially read through several data values until positioned at the desired memory location. An example of a sequential non-random memory device is magnetic tape, where you had to actually spin through the entire tape to get to the end or back to the beginning. A CD or hard disk drive has random access capability. So we'll just take baby steps right now, but we'll start out with a RAM. This is rather small, but you really have to start out with a smaller one before you can understand the practical, the high mega and the giga type RAMs that we have available in processors today. But the 2164 is a rather old static RAM, but it's really nice because it's very understandable right down to the bit level. So let's take a look at it. It's a static RAM. It uses MOS technology. It's set up with 4096, which is abbreviated 4K, and 1K is defined as 1024, which is really 2 to the 10th power, which is 1024. Of course, we're going to be 2 to the 12th power to get 4K. Okay, so memory locations. Now that's how many memory locations there are, with each location containing a single bit. So this is a bitwise sort of a memory situation, just to help us understand how these work. It's written as 4096 by 1. This is very small by today's standards, but by studying this operation, it's a good start for understanding the larger SRAMs. So let's start out by looking at the logic symbol. As you can see, it's got address A0 through A11. That's 12 address lines. If you take 2 to the 12th power, that's 4096 possible different combinations. So there's more than 4,000 different locations inside this chip. Each location has one D out and one possible D in. This is the same memory cell. We're either going to be writing into the cell or reading out from it. Now we've got a WE command, and if you read that, that's called the write enable. When that goes low, we're writing to the chip, which means we're sending data into the chip. So when you make that line low, the chip select, of course, has got to be low just to make the chip work in the first place. Now, when you look at the block diagram, here is the memory array. It's set up as a 64 row by 64 column array. That gives us, if you multiply those numbers, you'll get the 4096. So we take the address lines, and we'll take the A0 through A5, which is 6 address lines, and we'll use that to set up the row that we're going to select, the row, and then we'll take the A6 through A11, the remainder, and use that to select the column. And by specifying the row column, we'll pinpoint an exact memory location inside this array. Now the data in. The data in will come in if we have a high on this enable on this buffer, and we get that high from an AND, which is looking for a low and a low. Well, if you're doing a chip select and you got a low WE, then we're doing a write command, and that's why this is enabled, and the data will pass in to the column I input-output circuits. Now, to get data to come out of this, we have to have a high on this enable line of this inverting buffer, and that high comes from here, which says we have to have a low CS and a high WE, which means we're doing a read operation. And if you're doing a read, you're pulling data out of the memory cell. Now in figure 16.5, I give you a lot more detail on selecting the row columns. This is a 2147 4K by 1 static RAM, and we're looking at the address row and column decoders to select memory cell 1111 1, 1. So the high order bits are all 1s. We're going to place those on the A6 through A11. And then the low order 00010, we're putting those on the low order information. And there's that 1. Now this number right here decodes into the number 2, which is going to select row number 2. So row 0 goes across here, row 1, and then row 2. So we're selecting this row, and the cell within there is 11111111, which is decoded into the number 63. If you did the binary on that, that's the 63. So the column goes up and down this way, and when you pinpoint the row column, there's the cell. So whatever's in that cell, that information is going to be either written to or read from. Okay, so figure 16-5C shows a functional diagram of a single cell within that static RAM. So this dashed line is a single data cell. We can bring data into it or pull data out. These are MOS transistors, they're like they're FET, field effect transistors, and these are all N channel because the arrow's pointing in. Now, as soon as your bit select that came from your row column select is a high, this high is applied to Q3, Q4, which actually makes them a short circuit. So this cell is now connected to the outside world depending on which buffer is enabled. If this buffer is enabled, data is allowed to come in. So let's take a look at how you would write a 1 into this memory cell. First of all, to write, you'd have to make the chip select low and the write line low. This low comes out as a high that enables this buffer. Now let's place a 1 into this memory cell. If you put a 1 or a 5-volt level into this memory cell, it comes through, this transistor is a short, this 1 comes down and turns on Q6. When Q6 is turned on, it's essentially a short from ground to this point. This ground is fed back kind of like the cross NAND flip-flop that we looked at earlier in chapter 10, but this ground is fed back, which turns this transistor off, which essentially is like an open. Q1 and Q2 are just providing the bias necessary for their corresponding transistors. So with Q5 off, current will be allowed. And remember, this is a 1 here. This 1 is going to turn this on. VDD will be felt down on this transistor, and so that when you remove the data from the input by releasing the chip select or releasing the WE, this becomes an open, but we still have this bias current keeping this transistor on, which produces a 0, which turns this one off. So this cross connection here maintains that 1 in the memory cell by keeping Q6 turned on. Now when we want to read Q6, or the 1, we want to read it to the output, we take the chip select, keep it low, we make the WE high. That enables this line, which enables this buffer. Now the 1 that we put in here is actually going to be a 0 felt at this point. That's going to come out, and that's why we need an inverter at the D out, because remember, to put the 1 in, we actually turn Q6 on, so that 1 comes through, gets inverted in. I'm sorry, the 1 that came in turned this on, which pushed ground right here because this is short, and the 0 comes through, gets inverted into a 1 again. So the D in that initially came in as a 1 is going to come out as a 1. So basically this is the functional operation of what takes place inside a single MOS cell. You got to multiply that by millions or even billions when you look at modern RAMs of today. In figure 16.6, I'm going to show you how the address bus is connected to the A0 through A11 line. So what you'll do is specify the address of the cell you want to look at, and we're trying to read the data out, so we have to make the not WE high to do that. So here's the timing for this. So you set up the address bus at this point, and then there's a length of time called TAA, address access, before the data before the data coming out is valid. Before that, the D at the output is either in the high impedance state, meaning floating, or it's undetermined. So stay away from it. You can't read it until after you take care of the TAA nanoseconds and the TACS, which is the access from the chip select. Now here the chip select goes low. It takes a few, whatever the time is, nanoseconds or microseconds before the data is valid. So you have to look at the TAA and the TACS, and whichever one is longer, that's the length of time you got to wait before the data output is valid. Now after you raise the CS back high again, there's a THZ, which is the length of time it takes before the output goes back into its high impedance state so that you can do another operation. So the times are given in the bottom of figure 16-6. The TRC, which is the read cycle time, is 35 nanoseconds. That's the length of time from the beginning of your operation to the end of your operation. And then here's the TAA, 35 nanoseconds, worst case max, and then TACS, 35 nano, and so on. So the chip deselect could be as low as 0, which means it's instantaneously high impedance, or it could be as bad as 30 nanoseconds. And the next figure shows when you're writing to it, you're going to be putting data in. So the write line is going to have to be pulsed low. Of course, the chip select's got to be low, and you're going to specify the address that you want to send the data into. So here's the timing waveforms for that. And remember, the data comes in on the low to high edge. So here's the edge that we're supplying. So what you got to do is make sure you got valid data available TDW nanoseconds before this low to high edge. And of course we're going to have the new address available. So you set up the address, you pulse the CS line, and when this goes low to high, it looks at the data input line and it pulls that data in and places it inside the memory cell. And the times are specified as in this table: 35 nano for the TWC, which is the write cycle time, and then 20 nanoseconds for the TDW, which is the data valid to end of write. That's really the setup time. That's the time you have to set the data, make sure the data is valid before you raise this high. And then the hold time, where you have to hold the data there after the edge, which is really 0, which means this line could be back at the beginning of this edge. So these times are real similar to what we looked at back in chapter 11 when we first started studying D flip-flop time considerations. Now, to turn this 1-bit system into an 8-bit system, we could have 8 of these 2147s and take the D in, D out line, tie them together, and bring it into the D0 off the data bus, and then take the next one into the D1 off the data bus, the next one into the D2, and so on, all the way up to D7, such that when you do the WE and the CS, you're accessing all 8 of these at the same time with the same address information. So they're all active. The one cell in each one of these is active at the same time, so it dumps a whole byte down onto the data bus. When you look at circuit boards, you'll see them populated with many single bit RAM chips to make up a full byte. So practically speaking, we have, and I'll show you the table first, we've got a sample of some Hitachi low power static RAMs configured in different densities, a 4K bit, a 1 meg, a 4 meg, and so on. Now the 4 meg is configured as a 512K by 8. That means that there's 8 data bits at each of the 512K locations. So let's look at these different configurations. So in the case of the 6264, we've got A0 through A12. That's 2 to the 13th power, which is where you get the 8K from. 2 to the 13th is 8K. Each location, once you got the location, there's 8 bits located there. Okay, then the 62,256 is 0 through 14. That's 2 to the 15th power. That's where you get the 32K, and so on, and they get larger and larger, and they're even larger than that nowadays too. So it's up to you to look on the internet and search out some static RAM chips, and you can look at the latest configuration that's used inside your digital system. Now there's another type of RAM chip called the dynamic RAM, and these are the extremely large density chips that we use for our RAM inside our PCs. The difference is that they actually store their memory cells as a charged or discharged capacitor. So we'll look at that in the next section. Hi, this is Professor Kleitz. In section 16-3, I want to talk about dynamic RAMs. Although dynamic RAMs, or otherwise called DRAMs, require more support circuitry and are more difficult to use than static RAMs, they are way less expensive per bit and have a much higher density, minimizing circuit board area. Most applications requiring large amounts of read-write memory will use DRAMs instead of static RAMs. The main memory in PCs, in fact, they will be using anywhere from 2, 4, 8, or even more gigabytes of DRAM. So the main difference that dynamic RAMs have over the static RAMs is that their main memory is a charge placed on a storage capacitor. And what I'm showing in this diagram is if after the address decoding is taken care of, let's say we're trying to put a 1 into a storage location, in other words put it on a storage capacitor, you would place a 1 at the DN line, which was decoded to this point, and then provide a write pulse. Since this is an N MOSFET, this becomes a short, and the 1, which is plus 5 volts, will be placed on the storage capacitor. And then when you go to read, you would place a read pulse on the gate of a MOSFET, and this creates a short from drain to source, and that allows the 5 volts to be felt at the output. So basically it's the storage capacitor is either going to have a charge or not. Of course, the problem with using a capacitor is that the charge doesn't last forever, so we will have to refresh every 20 or 30 milliseconds. We'll have to read the capacitor. If there's a 1, we have to recharge it and recharge it over and over again, and it tends to decrease over time. So again, we have to keep refreshing these capacitors. In figure 1611A, we can look at the logic symbol for the 2118 DRAM chip. This is configured as a 16K by 1 memory chip, so 16K addresses. Now 16K is made up by the fact that we have 0 through 6, and this is actually going to come in as a row address, and by pulsing the RAS row address strobe, and then we're going to change this to columns, and we're going to pulse the CAS, the column address strobe. So actually what we have is a 0 through 6 duplicated for a total of 14 address lines. And as we know, 2 to the 14th power is the same as 2 to the 10th times 2 to the 6th, which is 16K. So with a 7-bit worth of row addresses, that'll give us 128 rows by 128 columns. You multiply those two numbers together and you get 16K. At each location is only a single bit. And as we can see in this diagram, we have a single D out and we have a single D in. We also have a write enable, which when it's low we're writing, when it's high we're reading. And again, we got the not RAS and the not CAS. So let's look at the timing involved in this. Oh, and by the way, up in logic symbol, here it is, A0 through 6, the not RAS, not CAS, not WE, and then the D in, D out, which are actually separate terminals. Now the reason they have a separate row and column address strobes is so that we can keep the pin count to a minimum. With 2 to the 14th power, we would actually have 14 address lines. So they've cut the number of pins by 7 by cutting it in half and just having 0 through 6, which would be 7 lines with the RAS, and then 0 through 6 for the column. So we've saved on pin count that way. So there is some precise degree of timing that takes place. So on the address bus, what we'll do is set up the address, the row addresses on the A0 through A6, and then we'll drop the RAS line low. This high to low signals the DRAM chip that it has valid rows. That goes into a row decoder, and then we take the address bus and we change it to the columns. At this point, now we have valid column information. We drop the CAS line low. Now the column addresses go into the column decoder. So now we got the row columns figured out, and there'll be a length of time after the CAS called the TCAC before the valid data is output at the address or at the data bus. The other time that we have to be concerned with is the TRAC, which is the length of time it takes from the row address dropping low, the RAS signal dropping low, to when we have valid data out. So you have to look at the worst case between the TRAC and the TCAC to find out when you'll have valid data out. So similar timing takes place when you want data in. So data in means that we're writing to this device. So you drop the RAS, you set up the row address ahead of time, and then you drop the RAS low, and then you set up the column address and you drop the CAS low. But there's a certain length of time, TDS, which is a setup time, where you have to have the data valid at the input before you drop the CAS low. And then there's a time called the TDH, which is the hold time afterwards, where you got to hold the data valid after the CAS drops low. So it seems like a lot of work demultiplexing the addresses. And by the way, we did have to demultiplex them because the address bus is going to be A0 through A13. We've got to split those 14 lines into 4 lines and 4 lines. So there is a demultiplexing on the front end. And then we also have to refresh the memory cells and deal with the RAS and CAS. Well, most manufacturers of DRAMs had developed a controller ICs to simplify this task. Some of the newer dynamic RAMs have refresh and error detection correction circuitry built right in, which makes the DRAM look static to the user. It looks just like an SRAM. So one popular dynamic RAM controller is the 3242, and what we have here is the row enable line. When this is high, the address bus, which is going to be 14 bits wide, A0 through A13, the first 7 lines will be split off and sent out to the not Q0 through not Q6, which are 7 lines provided to the various DRAM chips. We're going to line up 8 DRAM chips, one for the D0, one for the D1, D2, all the way up through D7 going out to the data bus. So again, the row enable takes the first 7 of these address lines and sends them out, and then when the row enable goes low, we're talking about columns then, it takes the last 7 bits, which would be A8 through A13, and send those out. And this is also coordinated with the RAS and CAS signals, so the DRAM knows when it's looking at the low order rows versus the high order columns. This dynamic RAM also has a refresh enable, and when this is made high, the counter counts through all 128 columns in an entire chip, and it refreshes all the capacitors. Basically, it looks at each capacitor in the columns, and it determines if any of them are high, it recharges them. And so this runs at a speed dictated by the count frequency on the count line. So to get these precise timing waveforms, they do have delay chips, so you could come in with a single pulse and have multiple taps on the output. And this is set up as a 50 nanosecond delay line. So when the input signal comes in, 50 nanoseconds later on T2, you'll get the exact same duplicate signal, but it's going to be skewed over by 50 nanoseconds. So when we went from this low edge to this low edge, the fact that there was 2 different taps, so this one was 50 nano inverted, this one is going to end up being 100, so we have a 100 nanosecond delay from this low edge to the first low edge. We'll use that for our row enable. RAS. And then the CAS will go another 2 taps to get off another 100 nanosecond delay from that. So these give us precise timing delays that we need for our RAS and CAS signals. And in table 16.2, I've got a sample of some Hitachi low-powered DRAMs. These are actually pretty small by today's standards, but you can look these up on the internet and see the higher megabit. And by the way, the lowercase b means bit. If it's an M capital B, that would be byte. So these are set up as this particular one. It's 256 megabits configured as 32 mega locations with 8 bits at each location. So the configuration is given in this chart also. These are kind of a low or medium voltage. They're not the 0.5. They're actually set up as a 3.5 volt memory cell. And they also have the 2 volt and then the 1.2 volt memories also. So a margin annotation that you'll see talking about inside your PC says here that modern PCs use 2 gig, 4 gig, or even more of DRAM. To physically mount so much memory, manufacturers solder several memory ICs onto a single board, which is then inserted into a special socket on the motherboard. These memory boards are called SIMs, single inline memory modules. There's also DIMMs, dual inline memory modules, or RIMs, which are the RAM bus inline memory modules. As memory requirements increase, these memory modules can be easily upgraded by the user without any special tools. And you can look all this up at some of the websites listed for you in Appendix A. So another type of memory is called the ROM chip, and we'll look at that in the next section.